August 6, 1945. Little boy falls on Hiroshima, and the world assumes this weapon was purely American. I'd argue that's only half true. Almost 2/3 of the uranium inside that bomb came from one mine, erased from every public map, buried in the Belgian Congo. Before we get to the bomb, though, we need to go back, way back, to a hole in the ground nobody thought mattered. In 1915, prospectors working for a Belgian company found something strange near a hill called Shinkolobwe. Black, oily rock, heavy in the hand. Nobody wanted uranium back then. They wanted radium, the glowing element that once sold for more per gram than diamonds. So the company that would become Union Minière du Haut Katanga, UMHK for short, opened the mine to feed a booming radium market, medicine cabinets included, quack cures and all. Picture the mine itself in those early years. Red laterite dust hanging thick in 90-degree heat, open pits scraped out by hand with picks and shovels, decades before anyone on site wore so much as a dust mask. Commercial extraction started in 1921, and for the better part of 2 decades, the whole operation ran on the logic of radium, not uranium. The uranium byproduct was almost an afterthought, something you had to deal with, not something you wanted. Union Minière wasn't just a mining company, by the way. It was basically a shadow government inside a colony, controlling copper, cobalt, and radium production across an area larger than some European countries, answering more to shareholders in Brussels and London than to anyone in the Congo itself. That's worth sitting with, because it explains exactly why one Belgian executive could make a decision this consequential without asking permission from Washington, London, or Leopoldville. By 1937, Union Minière closed Shinkolobwe. They'd already stockpiled 3 decades worth of radium ore, and the leftover uranium was just waste. Industrial junk. I find that almost funny, in a bleak sort of way. The most consequential mineral deposit of the century got mothballed because nobody had figured out what it was good for yet. Then, in December of 1938, 2 German chemists split a uranium atom in a Berlin lab. Fission. Suddenly, that junk sitting in Belgian warehouses had a terrifying new identity. Word moved fast in certain rooms, quietly, in 1939. Sir Henry Tizard, a British scientific advisor, sat down with Edgar Sengier, the Belgian director of Union Minière, and told him to be careful, because he was holding something that could mean catastrophe for both their countries if it ever reached the wrong hands. That's not a screenwriter's line. It's a documented warning, years before anyone built anything close to a working bomb. He wasn't the only one asking either. Around the same time, the French physicist Frédéric Joliot-Curie also approached Sengier, hoping to get his hands on Congolese uranium for experiments back in Paris. 2 different countries, racing each other quietly, years before anyone had fired a shot in this particular war. Makes you wonder how many other quiet, deniable conversations like that were happening in 1939. Conversations nobody wrote down. Sengier listened. And here's where this stops being a story about geology and becomes a story about nerve. In 1940, Nazi Germany invaded Belgium. Sengier's home fell in 18 days. Most people in his position would have frozen. He didn't. He ordered roughly 1,200 tons of uranium ore. Some records say 1,139, others closer to 1,256, loaded onto ships and sent across the Atlantic. It landed in New York and got quietly stacked into steel drums inside a warehouse in Staten Island, leased through the Archer Daniels Midland Company at Port Richmond. Sounds like the plot of a Cold War spy movie. Honestly, it basically was one. Picture that dock. Salt air, the metallic clang of drums stacked one on top of another, longshoremen with zero idea. The crates beside them held something more dangerous than anything else in the harbor. No contract, no American request. Nobody in Washington had even asked yet. Sengier just moved it. Call it paranoia, call it foresight. To me, it's one of the quietest, most consequential decisions of the entire war, and almost nobody knows his name. There's a twist most documentaries skip entirely. Belgium didn't fall cleanly. The Nazis captured a separate stockpile too. Around 1,200 tons of already refined uranium sitting in a facility in Olen, Belgium, seized in 1940. For a moment, and I want to be careful here, historians still argue about how close this really came. Nazi Germany had roughly the same raw material access the Americans would eventually control. They had the ore. What they lacked was the industrial machine, the unified program, or maybe just the will to commit resources at Manhattan Project scale. It wasn't until 1944 and 45, when the Allied Alsos mission swept through liberated Belgium and France, that most of that captured stockpile finally got tracked down. When Allied investigators reached Union Minier's headquarters in Antwerp in September of 1944, they weren't just looking for leftover ore. They were racing the clock because everyone involved knew the Soviets wanted the exact same thing, and whoever secured it first would have a serious head start into whatever came after the war. So for roughly 2 years, Sengier's 1,200 tons just sat in Staten Island, waiting. Nobody in the US military even came looking. Then, on September 18, 1942, a lieutenant colonel named Kenneth Nichols, second in command of the entire Manhattan Engineer District, walked into Sengier's office at 25 Broadway. Nichols expected a long, difficult negotiation. He didn't get one. According to his own later memoir, Sengier looked at him and said something close to, "You can have the ore now. It's in New York, 1,000 tons of it. I was waiting for your visit." 2 years of stockpiled uranium, sitting a ferry ride from the Statue of Liberty. And Sengier had simply been waiting for someone to ask. I don't think you can overstate how strange that must have felt for Nichols. He walked in, ready to hunt across 3 continents, and the answer had been sitting in a warehouse the whole time. A month later, on October 19, 1942, the paperwork caught up with the handshake, a formal contract between Union Minier's American arm, the African Metals Corporation, and the US Army. But by then, the real decision had already been made in that office at 25 Broadway. Now here's where the science gets wild, and it's the part of this story that deserves way more attention than it usually gets. Uranium ore, almost everywhere on Earth, is disappointingly weak stuff. Good mines in Colorado, during this exact period, yielded a running maybe 0.02 to 0.25% uranium oxide, U3O8 if you want the shorthand. Canadian mines did better, around 1%. Shinkolobwe's ore ran up to 65% U3O8. 65%, against a fraction of 1% almost everywhere else. That contrast is the whole story in one number. Nichols himself called it a freak occurrence in nature, adding that nothing like it has ever again been found. I'm not a geologist, and I'll admit I can't fully explain why this one hillside produced ore that rich. As far as I can tell, nobody fully understands why either. It might just be one of those anomalies the Earth occasionally produces and never repeats. Quick technical note, because it matters here. Natural uranium is overwhelmingly the heavier isotope, uranium-238, with less than 1% of the lighter, fissile uranium-235 mixed in. Bomb-grade material needs that percentage cranked up dramatically through enrichment. Shinkolobwe's ore didn't change that basic ratio. No mine on Earth could. But starting from ore that was already 65% uranium oxide instead of a fraction of 1% meant enormously. Less rock had to be mined, shipped, and processed to get the same amount of usable uranium into the enrichment pipeline. By November of 1943, American intelligence had put it in writing, in a report stamped top secret. The most important deposit of uranium yet discovered in the world is in the Shinkolobwe mine in the Belgian Congo, vital to the welfare of the United States. Read that sentence again. A colonial mine in Central Africa, described in an internal U.S. government document as vital to national welfare. I don't think most people would guess that if you asked them cold. Quick clarification, because it matters. There's a broader geological formation called the Katanga system that stretches into Zambia's copper belt. And there's published research on uranium occurrences over on that Zambian side. That's a different deposit, a different country, a different story entirely. Shinkolobwe itself sits firmly inside the Democratic Republic of Congo, roughly 20 kilometers west of the town of Likasi. If you ever see a map connecting this history to Zambia, that's worth catching. One of the geological papers on that side, published back in 1981, is even sometimes mistakenly linked to this exact story in research databases, which is exactly the kind of mix-up this video wants to clear up front. Once the ore started flowing under U.S. Army control, the whole operation went dark, almost theatrically so. Starting in 1943, shipments moved exclusively through the port of Matadi after officials decided the route through Lobito in neighboring Angola was too exposed. The barrels themselves carried false labels. Special cobalt shows up in the record, along with the almost absurd euphemism, gems. Crates labeled like costume jewelry, quietly loaded onto cargo ships, holding some of the most strategically dangerous material on the planet. By 1943, roughly 400 tons a month made that journey. Rail, river barge down the Kasai, rail again to Leopoldville, then out through Matadi into the Atlantic. On top of the fake labels, the mine itself vanished officially. American and Belgian authorities scrubbed Shinkolobwe off public maps for the rest of the war, and journalists hit a wall of denials and blocked permits. Look for this place on a 1944 atlas, and you simply wouldn't find it. None of this happened in a vacuum. And I think it's worth saying plainly, the human cost here doesn't get nearly enough attention. The ore came out of the ground by way of Congolese laborers working under Belgian colonial rule, with no radiation protection and, by most accounts, no real say in the matter. Historian Susan Williams, who wrote the definitive book on this whole episode, describes conditions that, in her words, put these workers close to enslavement. I want to be honest about the limits of what we actually know here. Detailed medical records from that period are thin, and I haven't found reliable documentation of exact casualty numbers. But the broader picture isn't in dispute. This was extraction built on colonial exploitation, plain and simple, and softening that with vague language would do the story a disservice. Susan Williams's research goes even further. She found that American intelligence officers operating undercover through the OSS were embedded in the Congo specifically to keep watch on this mine and make sure no rival power got close to it. Spies, in other words, guarding a hole in the ground in Central Africa, because everyone understood exactly what was buried in it. Williams also documents something that stuck with me since I first read her account. Several miners and their family members reportedly developed unusual illnesses in the years and decades after the war. Illnesses some later observers connected to prolonged radiation exposure at the site. I'll say clearly that establishing direct causation for individual cases this far after the fact is scientifically difficult, and I haven't seen a rigorous epidemiological study that settles it definitively. But the broader pattern of extracting one of the most radioactive materials on the planet by hand with zero protective equipment for years isn't the kind of thing that needs a peer-reviewed study to sound like a bad idea. As for the bomb itself, Little Boy carried around 60 kilograms of highly enriched uranium-235. That number is misleading without context, though. Producing 60 kilograms of enriched material required processing roughly 8,300 kilograms of natural uranium ore through the isotope separation plants at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The Manhattan Project's own procurement tables show that between 1942 and the end of 1946, the Belgian Congo supplied about 68.3% of all the uranium oxide the project acquired. Somewhere near 6,983 tons of U-308, containing close to 5,922 tons of actual uranium, bought at roughly $3.27 per kilogram. Canada contributed about 11%. Domestic Colorado ore made up around 13%. The rest came from scattered sources, including material the ALSO's mission recovered in Europe. Little Boy, worth remembering, wasn't even the design most physicists expected to work on the first try. It used a relatively simple gun-type mechanism, firing one chunk of enriched uranium into another to trigger a chain reaction. Simple enough that it was never even fully tested before it was used in combat. The plutonium bomb, Fat Man, needed a full test at Trinity first because its design was so much trickier. Little Boy's design was considered reliable enough on paper that scientists skipped the dress rehearsal entirely, which, when you think about it, is a genuinely reckless gamble to take with a weapon nobody had ever detonated. So, is it fair to say almost 2/3 of the uranium in Little Boy specifically came from the Congo? A piece published by MIT's Fletcher School makes that exact claim, citing historian Jonathan Helmreich. I'd call it a reasonable, well-sourced estimate rather than an isolated, laboratory-verified fact. That 68.3% figure technically describes the entire Manhattan Project's uranium supply, not a chemical breakdown of one specific bomb. Legend has it the ratio held roughly true for Little Boy too, and given how dominant the Congo's share was overall, that's not a hard claim to believe. Think about every documentary you've ever seen about the Manhattan Project. Chances are it opens in a desert laboratory in New Mexico, not a rainforest mine in Central Africa. That's not really an accident, and to me, it says something about how nations tell their own history. The lab coats and the blackboards get remembered. The shovels and the ore don't. It's a little like how everyone can quote the ending of a heist movie, but nobody remembers who actually cased the vault months earlier. Which brings us back to August 6, 1945. Little Boy detonates over Hiroshima. The world's attention locks onto Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, names like Oppenheimer and General Leslie Groves, men whose faces ended up in magazines and textbooks for the next 80 years. Edgar Sengier's name appears almost nowhere. In 1946, Groves personally awarded Sengier the Medal for Merit, the highest civilian honor the U.S. government could give, in a quiet, private ceremony in Washington. Sengier was the first non-American civilian ever to receive it. And then, nothing. No press conference, no parade. The man who safeguarded the single most important uranium supply of the entire war effort went back to running a mining company and faded from public memory. To me, that's one of the strangest injustices buried inside this whole story. We built entire mythologies around the physicists who did the math. We built almost none around the man whose gut decision, 2 full years before anyone asked him to make it, put the raw material within reach in the first place. I could be wrong about how deliberately Sengier avoided the spotlight. Some accounts suggest he simply preferred discretion, and I haven't found a source that fully explains his motivations. But the imbalance still bothers me. And the workers at Shinkolobwe? The men who pulled 65% pure uranium ore out of that hillside with their bare hands, breathing radioactive dust with no idea what any of it was for. Most never learned the true purpose of what they were mining. They didn't get medals. Most don't even have names in the historical record. That gap between anonymous labor at the bottom of a supply chain and household names at the top isn't unique to this story. It's practically a pattern across the whole history of resource extraction. It still stings every time you run into it directly, though. There's a domestic postscript to this that most people have never heard. And I'll admit I'm being cautious here because the sourcing gets thinner. Some of the leftover uranium residue from Congolese ore processing ended up stored in facilities around St. Louis, Missouri. Material that later became tied to long-running contamination concerns near Coldwater Creek. I won't pretend to know every technical detail of that chain. Reasonable people still argue over exact causation. But it's a reminder that this ore's fingerprints didn't stay contained to New York, or to the Congo, or even to 1945. This story doesn't get a clean ending, and that's exactly why it deserves your attention. It didn't stop in 1945. In June of 1944, Groves helped set up the Combined Development Trust, an Anglo-American effort built to buy up and lock down as much of the world's uranium supply as possible, specifically to keep it out of Soviet hands. In 1944 alone, the trust purchased roughly 1.5 million kilograms of uranium oxide from the Belgian Congo. Shipments kept flowing through the late 1940s and into the early 50s. 1,440 tons in 1947, climbing to nearly 2,800 tons by 1951, feeding straight into the arms race against the Soviet Union. Ask where the Cold War's uranium economy actually got its opening chapter, and there's a decent argument it begins right here. In 1960, as Belgian colonial rule in the Congo collapsed, Union Minière sealed Shinkolobwe in concrete and pulled out. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The Democratic Republic of Congo formally closed the site by presidential decree in January of 2004, and months later, in July of that same year, a partial collapse killed 8 artisanal miners digging there illegally. Even now, non-proliferation researchers describe ongoing concerns about small-scale, unauthorized uranium extraction happening at or near the site. People digging through radioactive tailings with no equipment and no protection, echoing in an unsettling way exactly what happened there 80 years earlier. United Nations investigators have flagged the area more than once over the past 2 decades, worried about smuggled uranium-bearing material slipping into illicit markets. Nobody I've read is claiming organized nuclear proliferation out of a flooded, concrete-sealed shaft. That would be an exaggeration, and I don't want to overstate the danger. But the fact that this conversation is still happening, 80 years after Sengier's warehouse in Staten Island, tells you something about how long buried power actually stays buried. I've gone back and forth on how to feel about Sengier by the end of researching this one. Part of me wants to call him a quiet hero. part of me wonders whether foresight that convenient just happened to also be extremely profitable for his company. Maybe it's both. I honestly don't think you have to pick just one. So here's the question I'll leave you with, and I honestly don't think there's one clean answer. How many other resources sitting quietly in the ground right now are one scientific discovery away from becoming the next Shinkolobwe? We like to think of strategic materials as things governments plan for years in advance. This story suggests something messier. Sometimes the most consequential mineral on the planet just sits there, unnoticed, until the world figures out what to do with it. And by then, the people who controlled it all along have already made choices nobody was watching closely enough to question. If you want to see where this same uranium trail leads next, into Cold War espionage, and eventually a 1968 operation codenamed Plumbat, that's a story for another day. For now, I'll just ask, why do you think Edgar Sengier's name never made it into the history books next to Oppenheimer's? Tell me your theory in the comments. I'm genuinely curious.